we will go to the next topic. This one has, if we get through it all, 2 different subjects. Julie kept giving me all these subjects, so I had to cram 2 of them into the same lecture, but I don't know how far I'll get. I know I'll finish the first one. If I get into the second one, we'll see how far I can go. But the first is the French Revolution. This is not so much a what about, but it is something that's very much misunderstood, very much not understanding exactly what the French Revolution was. And it has, and as misunderstandings lead to other problems. And it also has some very great God is good stories. Now, a lot of people think that because the French Revolution and the American Revolution have the same last name, that they must be closely related. They are not. Granted, they were about the same time. The French Revolution began in 1689, which was the year our Constitution was ratified, so very close in time. And some of the same people were involved in and in favor of both. Just to throw out a name you might have heard of, Thomas Jefferson. Of course, Thomas Jefferson was the main writer of the Declaration of Independence, but he also was a big supporter of the French Revolution. That's a little-known fact about Thomas Jefferson. And you may have heard of Lafayette, who came and helped George Washington in the War for Independence here, our American Revolution. And he then later was a supporter, at least for a while, of the French Revolution. So some of the same people were involved. What happened in America? I prefer to call it a war for independence because it was positive, not negative, constructive, not destructive. What the Americans were trying to do was preserve their existing system of self-government. They had had it from the beginning. All the early colonies, almost all of them, had a system of self-government. And granted, they still swore allegiance to the king, but the king was very far away. So most of them had elected legislatures, and even though there would be a royal governor on site, often the colonies were pretty much left to govern themselves. So we were simply preserving an existing system of self-government. And at the end, the people were well off. Their society, their way of life, nothing was changed. It was a positive thing. That's why I prefer to say American War for Independence. What happened in France was somewhat different. Now, if you ask your average person, what was the French Revolution? They'll either say, I don't know, or they'll say, oh, was that some kind of revolution in France? Or they might say this: it was a justified uprising by oppressed lower classes against a corrupt church, a despotic king, and an immoral queen, which brought rights to the people and left France much better off. Well, in that whole long list, there was an uprising. That word is true. There was an uprising. How much of the rest of the definition is true? Well, you can just see for yourself. So let's start with that despotic king and immoral queen. The king and queen at the time of the French Revolution were Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. We'll talk about Antoinette very briefly first. If you say to someone, what did Marie Antoinette say that's gone down in history? Oh, let them eat cake. In other words, here are poor people starving in France. And when the problem is brought to the queen, she blows it off and just says, let them eat cake. Obviously, if the poor people have no bread, they're probably not going to have any cake either. So it just shows that she didn't care about anybody, that she was involved in all these immoral activities, frivolity at the very best, and cared nothing about the people of France. Well, that particular quote was never said by Marie Antoinette. It was said, I've seen a couple of explanations, either the wife or the girlfriend of Louis XIV. I see different things, but it was certainly involved with Louis XIV, not Louis XVI. So Marie Antoinette never said that. People who hated her, including the liberals, the revolutionaries, hated her, and they tried to pin things on her. And so that's how that's come down in history. It's a little black legend floating down in history saying, didn't she say, let them eat cake? Now, Louis XVI came into a government that was an absolutist government that had been set up by his predecessors, in which the poor people were oppressed. There was a very unfair tax system. Protestants were not allowed to practice their faith. Louis XVI came into this system. He inherited it, and he started making reforms. One of the first things he said is, no new taxes. He said, the tax system is so unfair, it has to be changed. But until it can be changed, no new taxes. And then he started doing things to help the poor. He gave religious freedom to the non-Catholics in France. He brought back local self-government, which his predecessors, Louis XIII, XIV, and XV, had abolished. He was trying to make reforms. And one of the things he wanted to do was reform the tax burden so that it would fall more heavily on the upper classes than on the middle and lower classes, which is where it was from the days of Louis XIV. Now, if you're in the upper classes, that means you're the nobility of France. You're going to say, oh, way to go, Louis. I'm so glad you're going to make us pay more taxes. That's really what's necessary. Of course not. The old noblemen did not like this. In addition, Louis XIV had built a huge, luxurious palace called Versailles. And noblemen could come and stay there free of charge at the government's expense. So Louis XVI starts saying, okay, no more freeloading noblemen. They don't like that either. So the noblemen are not happy with what Louis and Antoinette are trying to do. Louis and Antoinette herself was concerned about children, about the poor, and she was involved in various charities. The other people that hated them were the liberal revolutionaries. France at this time had a strong movement of liberal revolutionaries that dated back to the early days of the 18th century. Their leader had originally been, he was not alive at this time, his name was Voltaire. Voltaire was an atheist, and he hated the church. He said it should be crushed. He also hated the monarchy. So these liberal revolutionaries hated the monarchy and hated the church. Now, remember, we've said in a previous lecture that monarchy is not intrinsically wrong, and democracy is not intrinsically good. It depends. It all depends. Well, the liberal revolutionaries simply said monarchy is always evil, and they said there should be government by the people. But you'll see how well that works out during the French Revolution. So, it's now the year 1789, and Louis has finally set up his new tax plan to make the burden fair. Just to show you that things don't always change. What he wanted to do was have an equal percentage paid by everybody. So if you're very rich and you were to pay, I'm just making this up, 10%, that would be a lot of money. If you were very poor, 10% would be practically nothing. But he felt this was equitable, and I think there's something to be said for that. And there was some candidate, some election not too long ago that proposed it. I don't know who it was, I don't remember. But the idea of what they called a flat tax, equal percentage, made more sense than what it was. Noblemen paying practically nothing, middle and lower classes paying way too much. So he proposed this. So there had to be a meeting of the equivalent of France's parliament. It was called the Estates General. And the Estates General was called to meet to vote on this new tax plan. The liberals decided to try to take over the Estates General and put in their program for a completely new government for France. So the estates were called estates because there were three groups: noblemen, clergy, well, bishops, and then elected people, elected by property owners. So liberals got themselves elected to most of those spots in the third estate. There were also some liberal bishops and some liberal noblemen, and they managed to take over the Estates General, change it to what they called the National Assembly, and basically start trying to remake the government of France. So to give you some examples of some of the things they did in the early days of the French Revolution. So 1789 is considered the beginning of the French Revolution. They wrote out and issued what was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, on the surface, looks something like the U.S. Bill of Rights. And it sounds good, okay, rights of man, will protect the rights of man. And the government said, okay, we're guaranteeing you these rights, we're giving you these rights, we're guaranteeing everything's going to work out, you'll have rights. You didn't have these rights before. Well, but they did. In the days before Louis XIV and Louis XV established their absolutist governments, the ordinary people had all these rights. They had no They didn't need anybody to give them a document saying you have these rights. They were considered their natural law rights coming from God. And since they were human beings made in the image and likeness of God, these rights were respected and guaranteed. But then you get an absolutist government and it starts ignoring some of the rights. And then come the liberals. And they say, oh no, we're going to give you your rights. You've lost them. We're going to give them to you. We are going to give them to you. So if the government can give you your rights, what can else the government do? It can take them away, as we shall see. Whereas the rights come from God, God's not going to take your rights away. Your dignity is protected. When the government takes the place of God, then your rights are not protected. They also put through what was called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. The Civil Constitution of the Clergy took over the Church of France and put it under the control of the National Assembly. So it essentially rejected the Pope and said the Church is now under the authority of the National Assembly. So it's basically a schism. They were going schismatic. It'll get a lot worse before it gets better, but that's what they were saying. And so they said, if a priest or a bishop wants to practice as a priest or a bishop, he must swear an oath of obedience to the assembly. The priests that would take this oath and say, yes, we accept the assembly as our authority, were called juring, J-U-R-I-N-G, priests, from the word J-U-R, which means to swear. So juring priests. Those that refuse would be called non-juring priests, and they were not allowed to practice. They refused the right to serve the people, to say Mass, to say the sacraments, or anything else. Now, France at this time was not in very good shape, as we've kind of pointed out. But when you talk about corrupt church, that was in that definition of the revolution, the vast majority of the priests refused to take the oath, and only a handful of bishops took the oath. So the church at this time, the priests and the bishops, vast majority of each, refused to take the oath. So that shows that there really was holiness in the church, but also meant that they were not allowed to practice. And so the few liberal bishops that did swear the oath then made new bishops, which would be more liberal bishops, and they could ordain new priests, which would be more liberal priests. Many of the French people would not go to any masses celebrated by the liberal priests. They would instead try to find the secret masses said by the faithful priests. Some of you might know the story of St. John Vianney. When he was young, growing up, his family had a faithful priest that hid at their home and said Mass for the people there. So we see that the government is now taking over the church. So it's taken over the real function of government, which is to protect people's rights, by saying, no, we're giving you your rights. And then it's taking over the function of the church and saying only those who swear loyalty to us, the assembly, are going to be allowed to practice their faith. So they continue making other changes. For example, they changed the geography of France. This might seem like a small thing to redraw the boundaries, but what it means is the revolutionaries thought they could remake society, make everything the way they wanted it to be, and cause disorientation among the people. So, in France at this time, there were provinces that mostly followed geographical boundaries, like a river, or a mountain range, or a region where they spoke the same dialect. They had some natural reason to be a separate province. The assembly said that's not logical. So they made a grid on the map of France, just nice, even boxes. They called each of the boxes a department, gave them all new names, and said that is now the French geography. So people were used to saying, I'm from the province of Lorraine, or I'm from the province of this, I'm from the province of Bordeaux. No, now you've got to learn this new name, and the people who may have been your kin before are now in a separate department, so it's very disorienting from people who are very traditional. The French were very, very traditional. They also redid France's military. Before this time, the French military, which was pretty small, but when the king needed something, he would call on them, was organized by regions. you might know that in the U.S. Civil War, people from the North didn't say, I'm in the Union Army. They said, I'm in the Union Army of the 20th Maine, or the something Pennsylvania, or in the South, I'm from the 1st Virginia Regiment, or somewhere North Carolina. You did it by your state, and you served together with other people from your state. And you had your own traditions, your customs, your battle flags that you took. Well, that's what France had. The Assembly says, no, everyone is going to be in the same uniforms, one same flag, and we're going to move everybody around, so you won't be with people who you are close to. And so the army, the military is redone. So it's no longer this brotherhood sense of unity from our region and our traditions and our families, but now the Assembly is telling us what to do. And we all have to be the same. Finally, at the end of 1793, the monarchy was overthrown. 1792 is the end of 1792. The monarchy was overthrown. The king was removed from power. And 3 men now had full power in France. The Assembly was still meeting. It changed its name a couple of times, but it was still meeting. But the real power resided in 3 men. One was named Danton, D-A-N-T-O-N. A second was named Marat, M-A-R-A-T. And the third was named Robespierre. It's one word. Robes as in robes, R-O-B-E-S. Pierre as in the French name, P-I-E-R-R-E. It's one name, Robespierre. And now, all those rights that they had guaranteed start to be taken away. Right of free speech. Well, is your free speech including speaking against the revolution? Well, not so free. Free press. You're writing against the revolution? Not so free. We've already seen if freedom of religion has been taken away. So the rights that had been given are now being withdrawn. The first really big atrocity in the French Revolution had actually occurred way back at the beginning, 1789. It was the start of the violence of the French Revolution, and it was the storming of the Bastille, which is one of those things that people misinterpret. A mob was stirred up in Paris to go and attack the Bastille, which was a prison. And the people in the mob were told that this prison of the Bastille is filled with innocent people put there by the wicked king. We're going to go release them. So the mob goes charging off. They go in, they massacre all the guards, they break into the prison, and they free all 7 prisoners, none of whom were put there for wrong reasons. There were some counterfeiters that were there. There was a young man whose family put him there because he was doing so many evil things. And there were a couple of insane people, one of whom was an Irishman with a 3-foot beard who thought he was God. The Bastille at this time was essentially a sort of upper-class place of putting people that somebody wanted to have out of the way, not causing trouble. So only 7. King Louis had freed any prisoners unjustly there. He was trying to reform the prisoners, and he had. He had also tried to reform the trials and the court system so you wouldn't have any people imprisoned unjustly. But anyway, that was the first big act of violence because they massacred all the guards and walked around with their heads on pikes and kind of danced around with that. That became a symbol of the revolution, putting heads on pikes, that weapon, the pike, and dancing around with it. The second big one, that really even worse in a way, because it wasn't just a mob stirred up, but it was an organized, done by the government itself. And that's what is known as September massacres. September massacres. It's September 1792. France had decided to go to war. The Assembly thought, let's go to war, let's attack other countries, try to overthrow monarchies or whatever else. And the French army was losing. If you're a French army and you're talking about freedom, we're going to bring you freedom. And so the general of the army says to his men, you guys have the right to decide, do you want to go to battle tomorrow? No, why do I want to go to battle tomorrow? So that wasn't working. So they were losing battles. So they started arresting people they knew to be opposed to the revolution. They said the reason we're losing battles is because of all these traitors that are against what we're doing. So we have to arrest them. So prisoners were full of people called traitors. And large numbers of them were the faithful priests. Also relatives of people who had fled France because of the revolution, but just in general, anyone that they kind of didn't like. So the prisons had these people in them. So Danton, Marat, and Robespierre, Danton kind of organized it. So Danton organized the situation. He said, give them a trial, and then when they're found guilty, execute them. And the trials consisted of this. Ordinary criminals who were there for other things like murder or robbery were set up as the juries. And they brought the political prisoners and the religious prisoners before the juries, and they said, what do you think? Guilty? Yeah, we think they're guilty. We vote guilty. Okay, good. And they immediately would execute them. Priests that were brought before the jury were asked, will you renounce the church and come over to our side on the church? And if they said no, which most of them did, they were martyred. A number of them have been beatified as martyrs of the church. They're known as martyrs of September. Total, counting the priests and everybody else, 1,400 people in 4 days. And that is known as the September massacres. 1,400 people in 4 days. Then they put the king on trial. The assembly held the trial of the king. And the assembly had over 700 men in it. They had the assembly, and the king was accused of many things, none of which he had done, or if he had done them, they were completely innocent. And he was found guilty. And then they had to vote to see if he should be executed. And they voted, and he was found to be, should be executed. The vote for not guilty was way over on the side of guilty. It was much closer. There were still some people who were reluctant to execute the king, remove him from office, send him into exile, do something, but not execute him. But the majority voted yes. And so in January of 1793, the king was executed, dying a very holy death. Antoinette was executed a little bit later, also dying a very holy death. Now, once the king was executed, and word of that gets around, that is going to lead to the first uprising against the revolution. This uprising was in the province of the Vendée, Vendee. The Vendée were just ordinary people. They had noblemen in the Vendée, but also peasants, tradesmen, ordinary people. And the noblemen and the ordinary people got along fine. They were devoutly Catholic. The area had had 474 priests. When they administered the oath from the Constitution on the clergy, 367 of them refused the oath. The other priests were ordered into exile. They had to leave the Vendée. The only priests allowed to stay were those that take the oath. About 100 or so had taken it. The rest are thrown out. One of the priests, as he was getting ready to leave, told his people, his parish, every Sunday, wherever I am, I will say Mass for you at 10. I hope you will gather together and join me spiritually in that Mass. And so they agreed to do that. So every Sunday at 10 a.m., they come down to the church and pray the Mass prayers together and make a spiritual communion in union with their priest. Eventually, the soldiers came and locked up the church, so they couldn't get in it. So then they went down to the cemetery. They figured that's the church was church grounds, a cemetery, so they went there. Soldier came and said, "What are you doing?" And one of them said, "We are at Mass. Our priest promised us he would say Mass for us each Sunday wherever he was." Imbeciles. Your priest is 100 leagues from here, and you think you are assisting at Mass. Prayer goes more than 100 leagues. It goes from here to heaven. So these are people holding fast to their faith in the midst of the greatest trials. Then, for the war that was going on, the French government, the National Assembly, the liberals, were finding it difficult to get volunteers for the army. Before this time, they'd been able to get a lot of volunteers. Now, no. More and more people are saying, no, I don't want to volunteer. So they put in a conscription law. They're going to draft people. And each department was given a quota. And so the officials would come down to the main towns with a number of people they had to draft. And then he would draw names. Okay, you're going, you're going, you're going. This tells us 5 people. We draw this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. 5 people, you're all going. The people in the Vendée heard about this, and they sort of spontaneously, but all over the province, said, we cannot fight for a government that is persecuting our church, and it executed our king. When the officials came to draw the lots, there were spontaneous uprisings. Eventually, they organized themselves under heroic leaders, some noblemen, some ordinary people, with the motto, for church and crown. They did well at first because the French government did not take them seriously. What are these few peasants? Like 30 barbarians perched on a rock? What are 30 peasants perched somewhere wherever they are? They're nothing. But as they're winning some victories and moving in the direction of Paris, they decide they better take this seriously. So Danton took charge of organizing an army to go down to crush the Vendée uprising. So the French Revolutionary Army was sent down and said, this is to be ruthlessly suppressed. This was, in a way, the first example of total war. In our more recent times, we've seen a lot of examples of total war. But here the whole idea, by that I mean war against civilians as well as against the military. We've seen that war against civilians far, far too often. They were said, have no pity. You've got to crush this uprising. Not just the fighting men, but to crush the whole society so they can't continue to have these horrendous ideas. So the army came down. It was merciless and ruthless. They killed not only the children, not only the soldiers, but also the women and children. There was one man in charge of the majority of the killings, and he had a special hatred for children and said they should be butchered without mercy. And so many children were among his victims. In total, this one man, for children and adults, he was responsible for killing 6,000 people, just himself. And so eventually the Vendéans were crushed, and the army had this victory. It took them a while. It took them a while to go through the whole province and find all the people they wanted to execute, but they are going to do that. Now let's go back to Paris. Back to Paris, we have the beginning of what's called the Reign of Terror. Robespierre, Danton, and Marat are in charge. Now they outlaw the worship of God. It isn't just to close all the churches, but they outlaw God. God is no longer to be worshipped. Instead, they're told to worship the goddess of reason. People could be executed without trial simply for not being enthusiastic about the revolution. I told you earlier how they redrew geography. Now they're going to try to control time. They make a new calendar. No longer can we have the year 1793 of our Lord. Instead, we're going to start over with years of liberty, starting with the overthrow of the monarch. So we are now currently in year 1 or 2, however far they got, of liberty. So no longer year of the Lord, year of liberty. Then we need to have a new week, because everybody sees the week as, with the highest moment of the week, Sunday. We've got to get rid of Sunday. So they turned the weeks into 10 days and just gave them numbers. So we've outlawed Sunday. It's out of the picture. And of course, when I tell this to my students, they say, oh no, you have to go 10 days to school before you get to the weekend. So 10-day weeks, 3 of those weeks per month. So you have 30 days each month. We've got to be organized and logical. So 12 30-day months, all of whom were given names relating to the season and rhyming. So you have the first 3 months would rhyme, and the next 3 months would rhyme, and the next 3 months would rhyme, next 3 months would rhyme, and they would go with the season. For example, the month of July was given the name Thermidor, which means hot month. An English satirist wrote an article and said, well, we should do the same thing in England, and let's rename our winter months to Slippy, Drippy, and Nippy. You might notice you're going to have some extra days at the end, 5 days, unless it's a leap year, then you have 6. So those are just declared to be revolutionary holidays. So maybe that's how you made up for not having any weekends or shorter weekends. So they remade the calendar, different months, different days, different year. So the church had been totally suppressed, and no one's rights were safe. But God can bring miracles of grace even in the darkest times. So here we're going to talk about some God is goods. God can act in history even in its worst moments. There are never any times so dark that grace cannot bring light. And so here are 2 examples from the French Revolution. Now we had the big 3 of Danton, Robespierre, and Marat. Marat had been assassinated by a young woman named Charlotte Corday, who thought that he was responsible for everything, all the evils. And so she thought if she could just kill him, everything would be fine again. Well, she was wrong about that. She did kill him. She stabbed him to death in his bathtub. Don't ask. And then she herself was guillotined almost immediately. So that left Danton and Robespierre. So now I'm going to tell you about Danton. We've already seen that Danton was responsible, at least in large part, for the September massacres, and also for the massacres in the Vendée. He was also certainly one of those that had brought about the execution of the king and queen. So he didn't have much to recommend him. However, there's no one so evil that God's grace can't touch him. And there was one good thing about Danton. He loved his wife and children. He was married to a much younger woman named Gabrielle, and he had 3 children, and she was expecting their 4th. He was off in Belgium trying to establish a revolutionary government there when he got word that his wife Gabrielle was dying. She had just given birth, and she was dying of post-birth infections. So he jumped in his carriage and ordered get back to France, Paris, as fast as possible. The driver of the carriage later reported that he heard Danton sobbing in the back of the carriage. He got to Paris too late. His wife died before he got there. So there he is with 4 motherless children. His wife's best friend, whose name was Louise Gely, G-E-L-Y, who was about 16, was caring for the children. Danton asked her to continue to care for them. And he recognized in Louise many similarities to his loved wife, Gabrielle. And so a little time goes on, and he sees the children under Louise's care, and he sees Gabrielle and Louise. And so he decides to ask Louise to marry him. Now, Louise knew what kind of a man he was. There was no secret what Danton had been and done. But you can imagine that Gabrielle had been praying, and now Danton asks Louise to marry him. She says, I will, under 2 conditions. Condition number 1, you must go to confession to a faithful priest. Condition number 2, we must be married. Our marriage must be witnessed by a faithful priest. She has just said 2 things that could get her executed under the laws the way they were. She says this to the at least second most, maybe first most powerful man in France. And she's risking her life when she says this. So this is pretty amazing that this 16-year-old girl stands up to this powerful man and says these 2 things that are capital offenses. What's even more amazing is his answer. He says, yes. But, he says, maybe he saw this as a way out, where are we going to find a faithful priest? She said, funny you should ask. Living in my home with my parents is a faithful priest. So now she's not only put herself in danger, but the priest and her parents. But Danton says, all right, I'll go meet him. So he took him to the priest. His name was Carrevenon. And I can't always get the vowels in the right place. I think it's K-A-R-E-V-E-N-A-N, Carrevenon. And he goes to confession. You can double check the spelling in my book over here when you get to it. He goes to confession, and you can imagine what the confession must be like. Bless me, Father, if I have sinned. My last confession was 20 years ago. I was responsible for the September massacres, the massacres in the Vendée, the killing of the king and queen, many other immoral persecutions of the church, and I disobeyed my mother one time. Now, since confessions are secret, we'll never know what he did in fact say. But the priest must have been convinced that he was sincere, because he gave him absolution, and then he witnessed their marriage. And so Danton and Louise are married. They go on a little honeymoon. They leave Paris and go on a little honeymoon. And then they come back to Paris. Now, at this point, some people might think, oh, he just said that. He was just faking. He didn't really mean any of it. He made up the confession. You have to have a purpose of amendment if you're going to be forgiven, right? We all know our conditions for confession. You have to have a purpose of amendment. So what's Danton going to do? Is he going to show that he truly has a purpose of amendment? Well, he does. He goes back to the assembly, of which he was a member, and he starts trying to persuade the assembly to stop the massacres in the Vendée. He's the one that ordered them. Now he's saying we need to stop them. So that's the first thing. I'm not doing these chronologically, but just in a different ones. He also, stopping the massacres in the Vendée. He also says we should release the prisoners that you put in this most recent roundup of prisoners. You only arrested them. They were liberals, but you arrested them because they weren't quite as liberal as you, but they're still liberals. We should let them go. Let those prisoners go. He defended someone who had actually written an article against the revolution as its extremes. He defended that person. And then he went to Robespierre, and he said, you should stop killing innocent people. Robespierre's answer, I haven't killed a single innocent person. He later went back a second time to talk to Robespierre to try to get him to change. But instead, at this point, Robespierre had had enough, and he orders Danton's arrest. So Danton is arrested. They put him in the same prison where the people were that he wanted to get released. And he said, gentlemen, I'd hoped to get you out of here. Instead, they have put me in with you. They actually decided to give Danton a trial, even though you didn't have to, according to the new laws. And so he was put on trial. Robespierre had a prosecuting, like the public prosecutor, and his name, unfortunately, is this long name of Fouquier Tinville. You want me to spell that? Fouquier-Tinvalle. And his goal, his orders, make sure Danton is found guilty. So Fouquier Tinville, or FT, as we'll call him for short, chose a jury of Danton's enemies. And then when Danton said, I will be my own lawyer, because he was a lawyer, and he begins defending himself, Fouquier Tinville runs to the assembly and says, quick, pass a law that no one is allowed to defend himself. So they did. He runs, all right, sit down, Danton, you're not allowed to defend yourself. Oh, and by the way, you also can't have any witnesses. So then FT proceeds to give all the evidence against Danton. And then he tells the jury, you go out and reach a verdict. So the jury goes out to reach a verdict, and they're out there for a while, and time is going on. And FT was surely convinced that they'll be back in 5 minutes. It's an open and shut case. So they're staying back there. So FT is not happy. So he goes back into the jury room, closes the door, talks to the jury, and a few minutes later the door opens, and out they all come neatly in a row and declare Danton guilty. So I asked my kids, what do you think FT said to them? And they'll come, it's like, oh, he said he was going to execute them all. I mean, they'll come up with things like that, which he probably did. I don't know what he said. But we certainly know that they came right back and declared Danton guilty. So Danton was sentenced to the guillotine, and we're now in April of 1794. He's taken to the guillotine. On the way, they used to take people to the guillotine, these little carts called tumbrils. He was standing in the tumbril, and it's going through the streets, and people come out to watch. This was entertainment in those days. And there's a crowd, and he looks in the crowd, and he sees someone he recognizes. It's the priest who had heard his confession. And the priest gives him a blessing as he goes to his death. The priest was disguised as a revolutionary, by the way. They used to have these red stocking caps that they wore, so the priest had one of his red stocking caps on. They get to the guillotine. Normally, after the head was chopped off, it would just fall down into a basket. The body would be tossed into a cart where it's taken to a mass grave. And Danton said to the executioner, you should show the people my head. It will be worth it. Because he had a great big head that had all kinds of scars on it. And he thought, this will be a treat for the people. Show it to them. He had also said, Robespierre, you will follow me. You will be next, Robespierre. So he made a little prophecy about Robespierre. So he was executed. And Danton expiated his sins. Now, he may have spent a long time in purgatory, but he expiated his sins. And Louise takes the children and she goes out to the country. She never wrote anything about this. Many people wrote memoirs of the revolution. It became a cottage industry. Everybody writing about their experience in the revolution. Louise never said a word. I think we know most of what we know from the priests, but Louise kept her counsel, and we really don't know what happened to her and the children after this. All right, so that's my first story of the God is Goods, how God can bring good out of the greatest atrocities. And sometimes when I give a test on this, I'll ask the students, what lesson does this story teach you? And they come up with many things. They're all true, such as that no one is so evil that God's grace can't reach them. And also the importance of prayer for others, no matter what. And so we see that very much with Gabrielle and Louise. I'm sure they prayed greatly. And yet, yes, no one is so evil that God's grace can't reach them. And my second story also takes place in 1794. And this is the story of the Carmelite martyrs of Compiègne. Compiègne is a small town right outside Paris. So by this time, we're now in the reign of terror has been going on full blast with victims at the guillotine every day, regularly every day. Prisoners were taken to the guillotine in daily batches in little carts pulled by horses or donkeys. The blade fell with monotonous regularity. Heads dropped into baskets, and bodies were tossed into a wagon, which then took them to the common burial pit, leaving a reddish trail behind. The soil around the scaffold had become so saturated with blood that those walking over it left brownish footprints on adjacent sidewalks. The animals pulling the little carts carrying the victims were refusing to enter the killing grounds because of the smell of blood. There were hundreds of people in prisons with no apparent hope to be saved. It was illegal to be a Catholic. On July 17th of that year, 16 prisoners caught the attention of onlookers who had grown bored with the work of the guillotine. These particular prisoners were wearing brown robes and white mantles, religious habits, which had been illegal for years. Who were they? They were Carmelite nuns from the nearby town of Compiègne. On Good Friday of 1792, they had been forbidden to wear their habits. But their prioress, Mother Teresa of St. Augustine, had told them to wear their habits under secular clothes. They turned their wimples into white caps to cover their heads and continued wearing their habits. On September 14th of that year, which is the beginning of the long Carmelite Lent, they were expelled from their monastery. They moved in small groups into friendly homes and kept up their religious life. Shortly after their expulsion, Mother Teresa proposed that the sisters make an act of consecration, offering themselves to God as a sacrifice for the end of the terror. The sisters agreed and renewed their consecration daily. On June 23, 1794, the 16 Carmelites were arrested because they had been denounced by the postmaster for still practicing their religious life, which of course was a capital offense. They were put into a prison that had once been a visitation convent. The Carmelites were told that they would soon be going to Paris. Mother Teresa asked if the sisters might wash their secular dresses. The jailer agreed. But the only other clothes we have are our religious habits. Might we wear them temporarily while the other dresses are being washed? Yes, said their jailer. So their dresses were put into tubs to soak. But before the dresses could be washed and dried, the nuns were ordered into the carts for the trip to Paris. So with permission of their jailers, they went to their deaths dressed as brides of Christ, wearing their religious habits. On July 16th, the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the greatest Carmelite feast day, the nuns were brought to trial in the courtroom of freedom and equality. They were accused of being fanatics. Sister Henrietta asked the prosecutor to define fanatic. Attachment to religion, he said. Exactly. The next day, they were loaded into a tumbrel to be taken to the killing ground. They were in the tumbrels, and they were singing. They sang the prayers for the dying, but they also sang the Salve Regina. They arrived at the killing grounds. They heard the raucous crowds. They smelled the stench of blood. They saw the shining blade of the guillotine. Mother Teresa led them in the hymn, Te Deum, which we know as Holy God, we praise thy name. As they climbed down from the tumbrels, singing, and stood at the foot of the guillotine, singing, the usually noisy crowd became unusually silent. When a Carmelite is dying, it is traditional to pray to the Holy Spirit. So Mother Teresa led them in singing, Veni Creator Spiritus, or Come Holy Ghost. Mother Teresa asked if she might be the last to die so that she might comfort each of the nuns in turn. The guards at the scaffold didn't care who died first or last, so long as all died. The first to die would be the youngest, Sister Constance, who had not even made her final vows, but kneeling before Mother Teresa and placing her young hands in the older hands of her spiritual mother, she made her final vows as a Carmelite. She kissed a tiny clay image of the Blessed Mother that Mother Teresa had kept hidden. Every good Carmelite must ask permission before she does anything not specified in the Carmelite rule. So Sister Constance said to Mother Teresa, "Permission to die, Mother?" Her mother replied, "Go, my daughter." As she started up the steps to the scaffold, she intoned the hymn, Laudate Dominum, Praise the Lord, which Carmelites sing at the beginning of a new Carmelite foundation. That day, there would be a new foundation in heaven. Sister Constance waved aside the executioners who normally had to help or force the victim to the plank. She lay down on the plank with her arms outstretched in the form of a cross, exactly the position that a Carmelite takes when she prays before taking her final vows. She was strapped to the plank was tipped, the neck stall locked into place, and the blade fell. One by one, each sister knelt before Mother Teresa. She renewed her vows, kissed the statue, asked, "Permission to die, Mother?" "Go, my daughter." She rose and climbed the steps. Then one fewer voice was singing, Laudate Dominum. The women were radiant. An onlooker later said, they looked as if they were going to their weddings. They were. For over a year, the sisters had offered themselves as a sacrifice to end the reign of terror. On July 27th, which was 10 days after their martyrdoms, 1 week in the new calendar, the reign of terror ended when Robespierre was overthrown by another revolutionary and guillotined. A new government was set up, and though the worst of the atrocities were over, France would continue to suffer the after effects right up to the present day. Napoleon took over and restored order, but he still was a revolutionary himself, but one who wanted order. And he still persecuted the church, capturing 2 successive popes, one of whom died in captivity in France. Throughout the succeeding centuries, France has had mostly liberal governments, which frequently oppressed the church. Today, France has a completely secular society. So we can see that the French Revolution was destructive. A few revolutionary liberals took power, and no one's rights were safe. Even the revolutionaries weren't safe as they turned on each other. The French Revolution shows us what happens when human dignity is not respected, when objective truth is denied, when the church is not allowed to fulfill its role as a protector of human dignity. Today, we are still suffering from the idea that governments need to be disconnected from God, that somehow the church prevents men from being free. We need to look at a comment made by St. John Paul the Great when he visited the United States. He was greeted by President Clinton, who said, "Welcome to the land of the free." The Pope replied, "Ah, free, but free for what?" The average person, if you ask them to define freedom, will say, "The right to do what I want." Pope John Paul repeatedly stressed that freedom is the right to do what I ought. The right to do what I want, carried to its extreme, leads to no one's rights being safe, no one's dignity being respected. It means that the strongest will oppress the weak. But a society where people sincerely try to do what they ought, even when they sometimes fail, means that rights will be protected and human dignity will be respected. And as that is true in society, so it is true in our own lives. We cannot be happy unless we are striving to the best of our ability to conform ourselves to the will of God. It's just that simple. The French revolutionary motto was liberty, equality, and fraternity. People were not free to do as they ought because a few had unlimited power to do what they wanted. The only place of equality was at the guillotine, where peasants, middle class, noblemen, and even the king and queen were equally beheaded. There was no brotherhood, not even among the leaders. True liberty, equality, and fraternity can best be seen in the Carmelite martyrs, who represented everything that the revolutionaries wanted to destroy. They were free to love God and love each other. They were equal in the love of God, and they had a deep and beautiful fraternity. I want to close with the closing words of Dr. Carroll's book, Guillotine and the Cross. Quote, "The Lord of the guillotine, Robespierre, died by the guillotine, but the Lord of the cross gives life through the cross, and final victory is his." Thank you. This is just two questions that came in from the last talk. One is just a piece of information which I did not know. I will just read that. New translations of Luther's diaries have been made public, which reveal that Luther committed suicide by hanging. He was tempted by Satan a number of times to take his life, and he finally did. This was verified by his personal assistant and those who found his body. So it was the final act of his total rejection of God. So I'll be interested in looking that up and reading more of it myself. And of course, we still have to pray that maybe somehow at the last minute he would respond to grace. But anyway, thank you for whoever gave me that information. Would you see the French Revolution as a sort of precursor to the communist movement and the secularist movement of today? And yes, I would. The idea of the French Revolution that you can use violence to set up what you see as an ideal government, that's what the French revolutionaries believed, and that's what the communist revolutionaries believed. Karl Marx, the founder of communism, of course, believed in what was called the dialectic, which meant that history was a constant series of violent struggles, that whenever a situation seemed to be at peace, immediately its opposite would appear, and there would be a struggle until the next one. Some of you are familiar with this. It was the thesis, antithesis, synthesis theory that Marx picked up from Hegel. But the idea of violent struggle to attain your goals. And so Marx said that once paradise was established on earth through making the whole world communist, then all violent struggle would cease. Well, we haven't got there yet. But yes, that whole idea of using violence to achieve your goals and of having this chosen few who know what the goals are and who's going to benefit from them and who's not. And then the idea that human dignity doesn't exist, personal rights don't exist, and certainly God does not exist. It all flows out of that. And in the long long run, in some ways, our secular environment, the idea that God should not be connected to the government at all, that certainly comes from the French Revolution and the Communist Revolution, and we see it in our own secular culture, that the government is not responsible to anything higher than itself. And really, even though we call ourselves a democracy, our government is not responsible to the people. To give just a major example, and that's through the courts, that the people in a state, for example, could pass a constitutional amendment saying one thing, and then the courts can just come with one judge sometimes to strike it down. How is that democracy? So we certainly don't have the idea that the people have a say in the government, in the sense that if the people don't want something, it's not going to happen. So, but the idea that the chosen few in our society, the media, the intellectuals, the politicians, they're the ones that can decide for the rest of us because we just don't know any better. And if we disagree, then that's a hate crime, and that's the end of that. All right, just something, since I didn't do the Communist Revolution talk. You can always read my husband's books. I'm of the firm belief that there's no point in having a husband who wrote books unless you're going to tell people to buy them. And so Red Banner's White Mantle was actually the first book that was published by Christendom Press, and that tells the story of 1917 and the establishment of communism in Russia. And then in his volume 6, it's not over there, but volume 6 of the History of Christendom series, it's called The Crisis of Christendom, and it has a good summary of the Communist Revolution and the consequences of it, from which, even though Russia and the Eastern European countries overthrew communism in 89, 90, 91, the effects of it have not gone away. They're still suffering in many ways, because you can't be in an inhuman system like that for so long without affecting the psyches of people on into the next generation. So if you had nothing better to do and wanted something that would give you exercise as well, there's his book, Rise and Fall of the Communist Revolution, which is huge. But that's only for the real something, I don't know what, but that's a book that will give you your life's work right there. But it's one that you can also dip into and see different aspects of the Communist Revolution. So